Good evening, everyone. I am Bharat from Invasive IISc Research Center. So, under Ek Bharat Shresth Bharat program, we are conducting a series of webinars. So, today we have with us Dr. Nehru Prabhakaran from Wildlife Institute of India. So, under Ek Bharat Shresth Bharat program, we are conducting the webinars. Covering the various topics on ecology, climate change, as well as the modeling landscape dynamics. So, Ek Bharat Shresth Bharat program is an initiative of Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji. So, aims to have a gathering of have a sharing of knowledge as well as culture and also the environment and also the issues related to the environment as well as climatic change. So, under this series, we have with us Dr. Nehru Prabhakaran, who is talking about mangroves never die, yet understanding their resilience, succession, as well as restoration, which is a critical aspect. So, I welcome Dr. Nehru from Wildlife Institute of India. So, Dr. Nehru is a DST inspired faculty. So, who has done his PhD in botany from Bharatiya University from Tamil Nadu. So, though he is from the agriculture background, he got interest in the plants as well as the climate change issues, and also the got interest in mangrove ecosystem. So then he did his postdoctoral research at Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research from Germany. So later he joined Wildlife Institute of India. Then he worked as a researcher there, and he has supported Wildlife Institute in Wildlife WII in various research projects, and also he conducted various research related to the mangroves and also their succession. So especially focusing on Andaman Nicobar Islands. So he also worked on how the post tsunami has impacted the faunal diversity in Andaman Nicobar and also the coast of Tamil Nadu. So his current research interest is in mangrove ecosystem and also their restoration and also the succession due to the various climatic parameters. So he is also a recipient of many awards. Naming some of them is he has received best oral presentation award from Himalayan Research Consortium from Dehradun. He's also received a award from Himalayan Research Associate Fellowship. He is a young scientist. He has also received a young scientist travel grant from the Department of Science and Technology for SCCS New York, and also he has received the international travel grant for the Center for International Cooperation in Science from New York, and also he's received a best photography award at the third International Mangroves Macro Benthos Management meeting Sri Lanka. He has also received a award from of Professor K. Ganeshan Prize for meritorious performance during the MSc at MCC. He has also received an award from Edward Brand's Gold Medal for mentoring and performance meritorious performance during the BSc. So he has worked on various research projects at WII, and also he has guiding the PhD students as well as master students for their project work. So with this brief introduction, I welcome Nehru Prabhakaran from WII. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation for webinar, sir. Thank you so much. So I request Nehru to present his talk on mangroves. Thank you so much.
Thank, thank you, Bharat. Thank you for a very elaborate introduction. I'm really overwhelmed. It's a pleasure to be here and sharing whatever we know about mangroves to a larger audiences, especially through Envis kind of these kind of programs. Um, Such a very nice initiatives where uh, people from various background, research and social angles come together to share their knowledge, and it's a very welcome initiative. And I'm really honored to be here to give my insights on mangroves. Um, when I talk about mangroves, it's kind of really something I cannot stop. It's very amazing ecosystem. You will also see why I say it's an amazing ecosystem. When you look at this background image, what you see is a vast stretches of forest that is dead and deserted, and then you see some green here and there. Those are a few mangroves coming up, right? So you see this one is completely gone and the other is taking over there, right? So these are some. I will tell you why about this place sometime in my presentation, but this is an indicator of how successful or how resilient the mangroves are. And with that, I start mangroves. Just imagine a system where suddenly you have water and then the water recedes back. And this happens on a daily basis. Every day, every 6 hours or 6.5 hour cycle, you get water inside and then the water goes back. And then whatever the land that is left behind when the water recedes, that is where these mangroves colonize. And in a way, they require land as well as water. So that's why sometimes we call it a amphibian forest, not because they support a lot of amphibians. In fact, they have very less support for amphibians, but they themselves like an amphibian ecosystem. And like any other ecosystem, like let's consider, it's rainforest or mangroves are also magical or mystic places. Like this kind of images that you get to see in the coast, it just takes your breath away. Right? And they are nothing short of any charismatic animals. Like for example, in the Sundarbans, you have Royal Bengal tiger, where the entire Gangetic plains play a major role in the shaping of this mangrove ecosystems, and these mangrove ecosystem Sundarbans provides an important habitat for many diverse fauna as well as livelihood of so many millions of people. And not only such charismatic species, but also species that are evolutionarily so important. For example, these kind of horseshoe crabs that are, almost their evolution dates back to dinosaurs or even before them. And mangroves still manage to support something like this. And like any terrestrial system, they also have their own top predators, like saltwater crocodiles, that primarily require mangroves for their breeding or various part of their life cycle is depends highly depend on mangroves. And not just predators like that, but also fishes and the predators of fishes, so many of them, right? So mangroves in a way supports very diverse group of organisms, and mangroves are distributed across the globe, but interestingly, not everywhere, not all the coast. For example, you have so much of coast everywhere here, and you don't see any mangroves. Whereas you see mangroves only on this line and only on the tropical coast or maximum in subtropical coast like in New Zealand. Otherwise, you don't see them anywhere. Right? They are very peculiar about. They are very specific to the tropical coastal lines. And in India, we have around more than 7,500 square kilometers of coastal line, and you don't see mangroves everywhere, but there are very important pockets of mangroves in India. For example, like I said, Sundarbans, you have a very good packet, and then you have Vitakanika in Odisha or Mahanadi Delta in Odisha, and then you have it Godavari Delta, and then you have Gulf of Kutch, and then across the Maharashtra coast, Ratnagiri and all. So you have, and more importantly, the Andaman Nicobar group of islands. So we have very diverse mangrove species present in these, important mangrove patches in India. And latest FSI report suggests around 5,000 square kilometer of mangrove cover in India, right? So the 2021 report suggests around 5,000, which is barely a 0.15 percentage of the overall area of India. But this may be, you know, meager amount, but it's nothing short of diversity or ecosystem role they play is nothing lesser than any other ecosystem. In fact, they are disproportionately high in providing ecosystem services. And the 2014 MOFCC report suggests that almost 20 percentage of the Indian population is directly or indirectly related to marine resources, and these mangroves play a very critical role in terms of marine resources. Not only in marine resources, but also entire economy of the coastal systems. And when we talk about mangroves, they need to be, a certain basic understanding that can provide you a, better overview of mangroves. uh, this is the, fortnight chart of tidal chart for Andaman coast. And you can see that on a daily basis the water goes up and water goes down. So this will be a high tide and this will be a low tide, and the tide does not remain the same everywhere. During full moon time or no moon time, recently we had a no moon, so the water levels goes significantly high, and then over time they reduce, and then you get to this slightly, less difference between high tide and low tide, and this is called neap tides, and these are called spring tides. So on a daily basis we have four, two high tides and two low tides. And what happens is, this is the intertidal zone. During the low tide, all the water is gone, and during the high tide, water comes through this land and goes up to here. Only during high tide like this, the water reaches here, and low tides like this or low high tides like this, water reaches only here. That means based on this tidal frequency or hydrological differences, the species that are found in mangroves also varies across a single site. For example, the mangroves like this require high inundation. For example, in a month you have 60 high tides, means these species require a minimum of 40 of the high tides. They need to be inundated during at least 40 times a month. Whereas these species does not require that much amount of inundation every day. And more importantly, the species that are very closer to the terrestrial land, they barely require just some 4 or 5 high tides. Like these high tides reaches till here, and only that is enough for them to survive. So each of the species from the coast towards the terrestrial edge require a different frequency and tidal inundations. So accordingly they are distributed in a single site. This is very important to understand, and I will tell you why in the subsequent slides. And when we talk about any ecosystem, unlike many other ecosystems, mangroves cannot be seen as a, isolated ecosystem. Rather, it is a very interacting ecosystem, and especially with the other marine ecosystems like sea grasses and coral reefs. And the recent research suggests that a healthy mangrove, a unaffected mangrove forest, keeps high diversity in seagrass meadows as well as coral reefs. And how they manage to do that? Because mangroves, they are very important in terms of many. They play a many functions. One is the filtering capacity. When the river discharges so much of sediment into the ocean or into the sea, mangroves does not allow everything go. And just imagine if all the sediments get into the marine waters, then you are more likely not to have these sea grasses, because the sea grasses, they require penetration of sunlight through the ocean waters for their photosynthesis. So in that case, you need the water to be a little more clearer, and so do the coral reefs. They require slightly a clearer waters. So mangroves, in a way, they act as those sponges for filtering out the sediments, and they trap the sediments and let more or less or very minute sediments get into the water system. And also, having located in this intertidal areas, and as a system with a high biomass, mangroves provide various amount of prey species for a lot of marine fauna, and the leaves that decays in mangrove systems, or the roots that decays in mangrove systems, or the sediments. The sediment means they are the nutrients. The sediments that they get into the mangroves, they are very very critical for all the benthic organisms, ranging from micro to macro, microscopic organism to macroscopic organisms. And all these macroscopic or microscopic organisms are very critical for the survival of lot of fauna that goes back and forth between coral reefs, seagrasses, and mangroves. And mangroves, in a way, play another important role in terms of carbon sequestrations. And in the recent COP26, there was a great debate about blue carbon potentials or nature-based solutions for reducing the emissions or trapping carbon from the atmosphere. And when such talks comes, the tidal system, the tidal coastal systems come into the forefront, because their capacity to absorb carbon or bury carbon into the soil is much higher than any other systems. For example, you see this all the three coastal systems and then the terrestrial systems. Coastal system easily outnumbers the terrestrial system in terms of carbon sequestration and carbon stocks. And there will be not much of a difference on the above ground, but on the below ground. So this is the below ground carbon stocks, and you see that mangroves among the coastal systems are the highest ones, but mangroves are extremely high, and they in fact 5 to 10 fold higher capacity to bury carbon than terrestrial systems. And there are so much of ecosystem services they provide. Like I said, the ecosystem services provided by mangroves are highly disproportionate to their size. And in terms of monetary values, if you calculate all the ecosystem services that is provided by a mangrove, then the estimates suggest that almost per hectare per year, there is almost 24 to 42 lakhs Indian rupees equivalent ecosystem services are generated by mangroves in a 1 hectare of land. And there are so many other things. And in terms of coastal protection, Indian coasts are not new for cyclones. There are so many cyclones. Even this year, we had quite a number of cyclones. And especially those cyclones getting into the Orissa coast or in West Bengal, they have to first go through mangroves. And mangroves, in a way, reduce their intensity. And what you get in the interior lands, the wind speeds get reduced because of the front layer defense by the mangroves. And their estimates suggest that almost maintaining mangroves are 5 times less costly than creating any structure that is that can withstand cyclone or any other coastal uh, coastal damages through natural calamities. And like I said, there is a climate regulation function, and there is a water filtration function, and there is a livelihood of more than 120 million people across the world, and especially in this fisheries sector. And why I say fisheries sector? Here, what you see is so much of fish, uh, young ones or fingerlings get into these mangrove systems, and this complex root system that is very characteristic of mangroves are playing a critical part in providing a habitat that is less suitable for any predators. And these fingerlings get into the mangroves, and many species of fishes in the coastal and marine systems get into the mangroves during their reproductive cycle, and they reproduce in mangroves, and the young ones stay in mangroves until they attain certain size. And they stay in mangroves for because these complex root systems is not easy for any predators to penetrate through and predate on this. And therefore, around mangroves, there is a high flourishing fishery industry. Like you see in Andaman, you see lush green mangroves of like 25, 30 meter tall. And then everywhere you'll see a lot of fishermen stopping by, putting their nets. It's a very economically an important system. And not only during the high tides, the fingerlings get into the waters, but also during the low tides, what happens is there will be a lot of burrows created by the macrobenthos like crabs, and those what you see here is one of such crab holes where the water is there, and then you see all these young fishes, and you see this mangrove root, right? These are the very critical services provided by mangroves. And what is the scenario of mangroves? Across the globe, they are highly declining ecosystem. Like unlike many other woodland forest systems, mangroves are the fast declining systems. And here you can see that one side you have a lush green mangroves, and the other side you have nothing, rather just human settlements and coconut plantations, right? And this is very uh, common across the mangrove distributions, because mangroves are also found only in the tropical coast, and the tropical coast across the globe is highly or densely populated by humans, right? That means these tropical coastal lines also have a high human or high anthropogenic pressure compared to many other systems. Therefore, there is a high competition for land between mangroves and humans. And just between 1980s to 2000, there was a decline of 35 percentage of mangroves across the globe. Just in 20 years, there was a drastic decline, and this drastic decline was driven by various factors, among which the major ones were agriculture and aquaculture. There are other things also like coastal development, but their contribution in by and large may be a little lesser. But the agriculture and aquaculture expansion in mangroves, especially in the Southeast Asia, have resulted in faster decline of mangrove cover across the globe. And almost 50% of mangroves are lost in the last century itself. So you can imagine the amount of degradation that is happening in mangroves. There are a lot of reasons for such a decline. One is like you see this agriculture, the aquaculture expansion in mangroves, and also a lot of the river systems are now discharging very less amount of water into the ocean, and these places where the river water meets ocean are the critical habitats for mangroves. And once the freshwater flow get reduced, then the mangroves will go through a stress factor, increased salinity, salt content in the water, because not all the mangrove species can thrive in a 35 ppm saline water that is typical of marine. It requires a less salinity compared to the marine water. So when the less water is discharged into the mangroves, then there is a high chances you're going to lose those mangroves. And then there are during developments, or during the landscape developments, the streams that carry the tidal water inside and outside the land, when you close these kind of streams, the entire hydrology of the landscape get affected. And then once you affect the hydrology, then there is no way the area will remain intertidal and the mangroves die off, right? In the last few decades, we see a so much increase in shrimp farming across India, across Southeast Asia, and this is one of the major reasons why mangroves are declining. Mangroves have declined across the globe, and these are, human-mediated disturbances, but also there are other disturbances. In the last century, if you see, there is a high increase in natural disasters. Just if you look at this graph, right, there is a sudden peak and almost like tenfold increase in natural disasters, and especially 15 percentage increase in high intensity cyclone across the globe. Right? And mangroves are in the coast, and that means these high intensity cyclones going to play a major role in the future of mangroves. And this is one of the sites that is affected by cyclone in Tamil Nadu coast, Muthupet mangroves. You see this now once the cyclone hits, and for some reason the hydrology also changes because of sudden deposition of sand and everything, and then you kind of lose all the mangroves. So the increased incidences of such high intensity cyclones means they're going to be a difference for the next, in the upcoming decades, how mangroves going to respond to this kind of disturbances. And not only the cyclones, but also when you look at the sea level change. And when you just have a careful look at this place, which is in the Southeast Asia, this is also one of the important pockets across the globe for mangroves. And Southeast Asia has the highest mangrove cover and also highest mangrove diversity and highest human population within mangrove systems. And these areas are also one of the highest in terms of predicted sea level rise. And if the sea level going to rise like this, unprecedented levels, then how mangroves going to respond? That is a big question that requires an answer for management of mangroves. And there are two options for mangroves when there is a sea level rise. Either they have to completely die off, or they can survive. How they survive? Mangroves being located in the interface between sea and land, they were always victims for many natural disasters and also sea level changes, right? And they are there for so many years. And how do they manage to, sort out their survival in the midst of sea level change, sea level rise, especially? Like I said, they trap a lot of sediments from the freshwater flow. Also, they create so much of sediment by their accumulation of roots. They produce so much of fine roots, and those fine roots add up to their sediments, and then those sediment accretion. When the sediment accretion and sea level rise are kind of matching up, then mangroves are more likely to stay their ground, and they just kind of this sea level rise and then rising the land is kind of level out and the mangroves survive. And only the problem is when the sediment accretion reduces, right? When the sediment accretion reduces, the mangrove is going to respond slightly differently. And the recent research suggests that across Southeast Asia or Asia Pacific region, Many mangrove sites have less sediment accretion rates. That means many of the sites in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific region have vulnerable mangroves for sea level rise. And when the mangroves does not accrete in enough sediments to match up with the sea level rise, what are the options, right? Like I said, there is a seaward community, there is a landward community. And when these kind of increase in sea level happens, then mangroves either they have to accrete more sediment and stay their ground, or they can shift their ranges, right? And when they shift, whether it is possible always, that's a big question, because not all the places there will be a suitable place. When the sea level increases, obviously there are going to be a lot of intertidal areas created here. But whether mangroves will colonize in that area, that is not very sure. And also, when mangroves, even if they manage to move, how individual species of mangroves going to respond to such changes is very is unanswered question even today. And here is an example what would happen if the mangroves move towards land. When I visited this site in 2019 in Andaman, there were a lot of mangroves in this area. The mangrove palm, Nipa fruticans. There were a lot of mangrove palms in this area. But back in 2021, this area is again, refilled with soil and reclaimed. And that means there is a high pressure on uh, tropical coast where mangroves exist, and even if mangroves move towards land during the event of sea level increase, then the pressure on the tropical coast is more unlikely to allow the expansion towards landwards. Rather, the lands will be reclaimed and kept as human land use systems. And I will give you a case study that we did in Nicobar group of islands. And these Andaman and Nicobar Islands are very, unique in their placement. They are, they're located between, in the in between area of two tectonic plates, Australian plate and Eurasian plate. And that means these areas also frequently experienced with high intensity earthquakes. And 2004 tsunami was a byproduct of one such earthquake. And when this kind of earthquake happens, it is also kind of changes the sea floor a bit. And the 2004 event resulted in drowning of these group of islands and uplift of these islands. And when you say the drowning and uplift, it's very simple. But when you imagine, when you see them, then you will understand the magnitude of such changes. Like this is on the west coast of Great Nicobar Island. There was an island that was largely colonized by mangroves, Megapod Island. In 2010, when we visited, there was one dead standing tree in the middle of ocean was all left of that island. So this is one example of what will happen to mangroves if there is a sea level rise. And also, on the North Andaman Islands, smaller islands like this got bigger because of the uplift, sudden change in sea level. And there will be a lot of land loss because of sea level increase. And what happened after this sudden change in coastal elevation is wherever the land drowned, the areas that were once intertidal were no longer intertidal, and now these areas are permanently inundated with seawater. That means these areas no longer suitable for mangroves, and mangroves eventually mass mortality of mangroves are experienced in these places. But these kind of situations also provide some interesting scenarios to understand the resilience and colonization potentials of mangroves. For example, when the land drowns, that also means the intertidal area is now permanently inundated, and then there are terrestrial areas like this. The coconut plantations are now become intertidal and where mangroves are colonizing. Either it is like this human dominated landscapes or like this coastal forest in Great Nicobar Island. The coastal forests are now become intertidal, where mangroves are gradually colonized. And whereas in uplifted sites, the opposite is the case. Here you can see that it's a 2003 image, satellite image. You see a lush green mangroves, and then you see the submerged coral reef beds. And when the uplift happened, these reef beds become intertidal, and these mangrove area that once usually intertidal now don't receive any tidal water, hence are getting colonized by terrestrial forests, right? But wherever there is a uplifted reef beds like this, you can see some 500-meter wide or even up to 800-meter wide coral reef beds in the coast we have seen have become uplifted and now providing an habitat for mangroves to colonize. And mangroves are one of the highly resilient system. They withstand this tidal waters, and they manage to colonize this kind of sites where hardly any sand or hardly any soil. So in that way, they have high resilience. And we did a very simple study in Nicobar Islands. We just want to check how many, how this drowning impacted mangroves, and how the mangrove species are responding to this kind of sudden change in sea level rise. And what we did was we just surveyed the entire coast of Nicobar group of islands, and we just counted all the species or all the individuals present in the places, and then we checked what were the species present in these islands or present in these sites before the tsunami and after the tsunami based on our study. So what our results suggested was there were five species of mangroves that were never reported in these islands were reported for the first time. But what is more important was there are four species of mangrove that were very common in these islands have completely gone extinct from these islands. That is, we call it as local extinction. And there was a just one event caused 97% of mangrove vegetation loss. Right? Then we also see species like Sonaretia ovata, Scapifora hydrophilicia, which were never reported in these islands, coming and coming and colonizing in this new intertidal areas. And from where the seed source is coming, from where these species are coming, and how they get established in these areas, we still need to understand these aspects. And like I said, whether all the species going to be equally affected by rising sea level, the one site that we observed in Carnicobar provides some insights for that. This particular site, where we are clicking this picture from the landward edge or from the terrestrial plantations, you see that all these backward mangroves, usually dominated by a species called Bruguera, there was a mass mortality of all the trees. And then you see this rhizophora trees that grow towards sea, they manage to survive the sudden change in sea level. That means not all the mangrove species are equal in their response to sea level rise. Rather, very few species will manage to survive, and many species we may lose. And when this kind of mass tree mortalities happens, how we can restore these areas and what are the things we need to pay attention. The surviving trees provide some insights for that. Like in many places, many degraded sites, you see this one tree that survived the disturbance, and then around the tree you see abundance of the same species, high density of individuals colonizing in the entire area, almost like 50 square meter. If you say from the tree, you will see all of these species on it. So one tree that survived means a lot for the recovery of the entire system. And we did this study in the same site in Carnicobar and one more site, where we looked at what is the influence of surviving vegetation on the recovery of mangroves. And you can see that this site lost almost 70% of its mangroves, and There were 30 percentage of remaining mangroves, and we tracked how the vegetation recovery progresses. And then one more site in other place, other island. Again, this site it lost all its mangroves, and we tracked how the presence and absence of such vegetation influence the recovery. We found that almost from 30, it increased to 80 percentage within 15 years, the vegetation cover. Whereas this site, the vegetation recovered to yeah, maximum of 4 percentage. So that means there is a high chances that if you have a surviving trees, then they will enable the area to get colonized by vegetation much quickly than a site that does not have a vegetation at all. So this kind of give you some insights for a restoration aspect or management aspects. And why I say that because the reason estimate in mangroves in India suggests that almost 70% of the Indian mangroves are either classified as open mangroves or moderate cover mangroves. That means there is a high potential for recovery in many of the already existing mangrove forests. And this decade is itself declared as a UN decade for ecosystem restoration, and there are so much of a growing body of scientific literature suggests that so much of land is available for restoration, and especially in terms of mangroves, we have so much of possibilities. And however, so many at times mangrove restorations are kind of completely lost the concept how to restore. And in that case, we need to first understand the importance of mangrove restoration and then how to go about it. And this is kind of a graph that explains from the monetary value aspect, published recently by Professor Kadirisan, that you see that the increased mangrove cover and also you see the fish catch values, carbon credits. So with the increase in mangroves, everything increases, right? There is a positive change, and these need to be put through in a better way to influence mangrove restoration across the country. And when we do a restoration, many a times across the globe there was a gross amount of failure in mangrove restoration, and that is largely because of four questions that was not asked before they started a restoration program. First, there are these four questions. Is it necessary to restore, or where to restore, what to restore, and how to restore? These are the four important questions that need to be asked. And even among the restoring agencies, the concerns need to be achieved first in terms of what is ecological restoration. Then only we can take these success rates in a much higher levels. And why I say that because just consider this mangrove area, and suddenly for some reason you lose all the mangroves. The mangrove become like this. You see all the dead trees here, and then you see something else is colonized. And what happened in this area is this is east coast of North Andaman, and the other image is west coast of North Andaman. This east coast, you don't have much of a difference in elevation change, whereas in west coast, the area uplifted. So the tidal water, there is, though the area still remain as intertidal, but the amount of tides water getting into this area has become reduced, has become less. That means only species that can survive in a site with less tidal influence can colonize these areas, not the same species that earlier existed. That means if the environmental conditions in that site is completely changed, then your restoration should also include that aspect. You cannot plant the same species here and expect a success, right? That's why where to restore and what to restore. Like we were, discussing in the early part of this presentation, there were mangrove species of different preference for tidal inundations, right? If you're going to plant these species here, they're not going to survive. And if you're going to plant these species here, they're neither going to survive, right? That means first you need to understand the art ecology of each of the species, and accordingly you use them in the restoration programs. And across the globe, the recently it is estimated that around 2% of the restoration efforts have provided a desirable outcomes. That means there is a big shortage of 98% where you don't get a desirable outcomes as a from the restoration programs. And that means in terms of mangrove restoration, so many things need to be understood first. And these are some five critical aspects of it. First thing is, like I said, understand the art ecology of the species. Each species require different microhabitats or tidal inundations. And if the site hydrology has changed, then you cannot, bring back the same species that existed before. So unless until you restore the hydrology, you cannot expect the same species. Rather, there will be a different species colonized, right? And then any site, first you assess the modification, why the mangrove degraded in that site. Because there could be many reasons. It could be environmental reason or it could be anthropogenic reasons. If you don't address those reasons, whether it is logging for firewood or whether it is cattle grazing, if you don't remove those threats, then your restoration program is not going to be successful. And then include all these things into the restoration program. And more importantly, if there is a remnant trees that can naturally send out their propagules and naturally colonize that area, then there is no need for a mangrove any interference. Rather, you just protect the area. Naturally it will colonize because there is a remnant vegetation, there is enough seed source coming by the waters. That means mangroves will recover easily. So if these four steps is not followed, if the natural recruitment or natural recovery is not happening after these four steps, then only you invest on a human efforts towards the restoration. For example, consider this area. There is a remnant tree, but you see all the degraded vegetation here. And first, we need to understand why the remnant tree could not, you know, populate this area, or why the recruitment could not happen. Because there is a high cattle pressure in that particular area. If you don't remove the cattle pressure, then there is no reason, no way you're going to restore the mangroves here. And you see here two sites, both are affected by the same cyclone in east coast of India. And here you see the vegetation is coming back after the initial disaster. And then here the vegetation is not coming back. The reason is hydrology, the change in hydrology. One side, there was a lot of sand deposition, and that means the water is not going in and out properly. And stagnation of water killed all the mangroves, right? Whereas here, the tidal regime, nothing happened to the tidal regime. Only the trees that were there died because of the cyclone impact. And there was enough seed source and there was enough seed bank. So within some 4 5 years, you see a 5 meter height vegetation covered that area. Whereas here, it's completely still without any vegetation. So in such cases, we need to first invest on restoring the hydrology, not just planting species going to do any change in this area. Rather, restoring the hydrology will automatically repopulate this area. And like I was emphasizing, the area which was earlier providing an habitat for high flooding mangroves are now have become less tidal influenced, and that means only dry mangrove species can colonize here. Whereas here, what you see is you see this bamboo sticks and you see this rhizophora species. Rhizophora can no longer survive in these areas because it's become very dry. And we need to have a better awareness about these mangroves, because just imagine this entire area went through a restoration program and there was a lot of human effort and then money involved, but you're not going to get any success if you're going to plant the wrong species here. And whereas there is this species, Phoenix pallidosa, is automatically, is naturally colonizing, so you need to allow this natural colonization rather than planting anything here. And like this big events where planting lakhs of seedlings, and when you plant this kind of seedlings in seagrass meadows, it's not only providing any outcomes, but also it will affect the other systems like seagrasses. So you first understand whether this area is suitable for mangroves or not before you planting anything. And many restoration programs like this, the fishbone method is very advertised as a very successful model. Yes, there are many sites where we had success, but there are many sites like this. It's not suitable for mangroves. Rather, it's a salt marsh area. You cannot have mangroves. This area does not have a tidal waters. Rather, water gets stagnated here during the monsoons, and during the dry season water is completely dry. So this is a salt marsh area. So here you cannot have mangroves. So investing anything in this kind of area is only going to end up in a failure. So first we need to understand the area, understand the species that required to be planted, and understand why the natural recruitment is not happening in that site before we do anything in that area for a restoration. And recently, we conducted a study to understand how mangrove studies across India, and what we found was very, large proportion of scientific research is also done by a single institute without much of a collaboration. So, having a very complex systems with complex problems, mangrove also require a collaboration effort from various institutions and various players. That means the future, if we collaborate efficiently, then we can understand them well, so that that could contribute to the better management of mangroves. And also a lot of other organisms in mangroves we know nothing about. So investing on studies on these organisms could provide more value for why to manage mangroves, not just because of its vegetation, but also so much of other organisms that colonize mangroves. And lastly, ecology is a permanent economy, like said by Sundarlal Bahuguna. We need to see mangroves in that context, right? So, providing a better solutions through ecology is much more important for management of mangroves, but also management of the entire coastal ecosystems. With that, I acknowledge all my funding agencies and the students who helped me collecting a lot of data. And thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nehru, for sharing your vast experience as well as your observation at Andaman Nicobar. So there are some questions as well as appreciation. So there is a appreciation from Vijay. He says very nice lecture for. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And there is a another appreciation from Mahesh. Thank you for informative lecture, sir. So there is a question from Varun Sharma. Sir, can you highlight the carbon sequestration potential comparing with the terrestrial plants?
Yeah, so in mangroves, one interesting thing is there is not much of a difference between terrestrial and mangroves in terms of above ground biomass, the biomass that is above the ground. Whereas below ground, the terrestrial system, you have a more of a aerobic environment where easily the degradation happens quite easily, and then there is a lot of respiration happens, microbial decomposition, everything happened in the terrestrial system. Whereas in mangroves, it is an anaerobic environment. So the carbon once go into the soil, it stays for a very long time. That is a one major difference why terrestrial system could not have too much of a below ground carbon compared to mangrove systems. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you. There is another question. I came across some research on impact of dams on mangrove community. Requesting your use, please. This is the question from Manasvi Kiran.
Sure. I think during my lecture I also highlighted that. So the rivers, there are a lot of things around rivers and mangroves, right? So mangroves require fresh water getting into the oceans, whereas rivers, by and large, the fresh water, the fresh water it carries supports economic growth, supports the human population growth, supports agriculture. That means with time, during the last many decades, the amount of fresh water that get into the ocean system has declined drastically. And even many a times politically it is projected that any water that reaches sea is a waste of fresh water, right? So this kind of attitude need to be changed, or rather the awareness need to be built in such a way that some amount of ecological flow is required to keep the entire system in place. And yeah, definitely there is a lot of research that highlights that reduced flow of waters by damming have reason to decline of mangroves. Yes, there is, we cannot deny that, but more of a awareness need to be built, especially with it also requires some political um, stimuli to get this message across to various stakeholders.
Okay, thank you, thank you. There is a question from Sushmita. What is the impact of organic and inorganic pollutants on mangrove sediments?
Yeah, there are recently quite a number of studies coming up on this aspect, and even microplastics, for example. Microplastics kind of reduces the efficiency of this uh, nematophores, the mangrove breathing roots. So it kind of blocks the breathing roots, and still it is not quantitatively evaluated, but by and large it is hypothesis that the more and more microplastics into the mangrove environment means the efficiency of mangrove breathing roots will decline. And again, in terms of other pollutants, yes, very few species can withstand pollution. Like Abyssinia marina, they can withstand high pollutant loads, but not all the mangrove species. So definitely pollutions will be one factor that can cause a lot of negative impacts on mangroves, especially in human-dominated landscapes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Sandeep Kumar. He wanted a clarity whether the 3,000 species of fish in mangrove ecosystem. Uh, he feels that it is a questionable. What's your comment on that?
Um, I'm not a fish ecologist, so I rather refrain from answering. But many literature suggests that there are high diversity of fishes. Not only the entire life cycle they stay in mangroves, but they kind of only during some part of their life cycle they come to mangroves. Not all across their life cycle they require them. Yeah.
Okay. So one more question from Sushmita. What is the impact of? Sorry, this I have already asked. There is a one more question from Sushmita again. How does invasive fish species alter the mangrove ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Invasive species, yes. Um, by and large, what invasive species does is it completely changes the dynamics of prey and predator relationships. And in mangroves, I don't know how much prevalent it is, but what it can trigger is the cascading effect of preying the invasive species preying upon so much of microbenthic organisms could definitely alter the entire species dynamics. And each of the mangrove species, benthic organisms, have their own functional roles. And when the water recedes, many of the benthic organisms play the major role in nutrient cycling. And if the species composition of faunal diversity going to affected, then it will definitely influence the overall functioning of the ecosystem in terms of nutrient dynamics or nutrient cycling. Everything will be altered, and these effect and altering of these things what it going to have it on mangroves, that yet to be studied. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a question from Divya, Divya Soman. Considering the fact that most of the loss in mangrove is due to aquaculture and agriculture, how successful can be the community participation in mangrove restoration?
Very important. It is very important, the community participation in mangrove restoration, because there are many success stories across Southeast Asia. Especially there is a mangrove action project. There is a group of researchers and motivated by conservation and management goals. They had a lot of community participation. Not only community participation, it rather participation of various groups, whether it is researchers, community, and policymakers. All these three comes together means makes a lot of effect on or influence on mangrove restoration. Many a times when there is a community, if there is a gap between these three players, researchers, policymakers, and community, then the restoration efforts will more likely to end up in a failure. And if the policymaker does not listen, does not consider the scientific aspects, then that leads to planting wrong species in wrong places. And also, if there is not much of a discussion happened between the restoration agency and community, then community has a usage for that place, whether it could be firewood or whether it could be cattle grazing, so many other things. If the community is not taken into consideration, then again you're going to kind of end up in a failure attempt on restoration. So bringing together researcher, community, and policymakers is a best way forward for mangrove conservation and restoration. Yeah.
Okay. There is a question from Manasvi again. Whether the afforestation activities can be the success in establishing mangrove community as compared with the earlier.
Whether the afforestation activities can be the success in establishing mangrove. Yes, I mean, afforestation, definitely any afforestation efforts that includes scientific background and take into consideration community and stakeholders, definitely it will provide a on ground improvement in mangrove cover.
Okay. There is a question from Yogita. Mangrove are highly productive ecosystem. Still, why they are undervalued?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So, what we see in mangrove is uh, it is again a perspective. Many people see it in a different way. If you ask people who lives just behind mangroves, and they know that because of these mangroves they were protected by a cyclone, and because of these mangroves we get so much of crab or fish, they value its presence. But what about these people who don't use mangroves for any of their livelihood activities? For them it will be just a provider of so much of mosquitoes, right? Mangroves also, it has so much of mosquitoes, are the smell it provides. There are, it's just a perception. So that means there was a lot of lot of lacuna in awareness about why the mangroves are important. And rather you kind of switched your entire focus on agriculture, and then even the shrimp farm is only uh, economically beneficial for a few years. But after 5 years or 10 years cycle, the shrimp farming is not going to be sustainable in that area. Whereas having mangroves in that area is going to contribute for a very longer time. So these kind of awareness was lacking in the past. But in the recent times, the mangrove deforestation across the globe has declined drastically. I think still we are into kind of zero point 0.6 or 0.7 percentage annual, but that is a greater decline in the last few decades. There is a increased awareness that contributing the less degradation of mangroves in the recent past.
Okay. Okay. Again, question from Sushmita. What factors decide if mangrove undergoes succession or at steady state? How does anthropogenic factors contribute to this?
So these things can be evaluated by just studying the mangrove systems. You just when you see a older trees and when you see a younger saplings that come up, that will kind of give you a glimpse about whether this area is changing or whether this area is static. That was the first part of the question. What was the second part of the question?
How does anthropogenic factors contribute for this?
Yeah, so anthropogenic factors can contribute largely through kind of changing, altering the environmental conditions. Let's say you just built a road that blocked the water flow in a mangrove area. That means the hydrology is changed. Once the hydrology changed, that means the mangrove species will respond to the change in hydrology. So there are many such case studies that suggested anthropogenic influence on changing the environmental conditions lead to change in mangrove communities. So only through research we can highlight these things. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. There is again appreciation from Dakshana Sri Gandhi. Thank you, sir, for your lecture. So, if there are any questions, please post in the comment section. We will try to get it answered by the Dr. Nehru. So, we will wait for a minute. So, if there are any questions, we will try to discuss here. So, participants, if you have any questions, please post it in a comment box so that we will try to get it answered. Okay, looks like there are no questions. I thank on behalf of Envis ISC Research Center. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and also we want to thank Professor Lee because you are accepting our invitation, though you are traveling for field work from tomorrow. So, thanks for taking pain and presenting for the benefit of participant. So, thank you so much for. Also answering all the questions. At last, we got one more question. Sorry. In Kerala, majority of the mangrove patches are under private properties, and the area are being reclaimed for many development. Government has limited control over it. So, is it a serious issue in India?
Yes, that is a very important question. Many sites we have seen this happening, and especially in the west coast of India, there are so much of mangroves that are outside the protected area network, and it's still a challenge how we going to get these you know mangroves that are outside the protected area networks into the mainstream protected area. That would be critical for the long term sustainability of mangroves across many sites. So we still need to take some steps forward. And in fact, Sri Lanka in that case can be a one interesting case study. So after 2004 tsunami, there was an increased awareness about mangroves and their role in coastal protection. That leads to the government now passing a legislation that any mangrove area is a government property and there is no logging or any activities banned in mangrove areas. Right, all the mangrove patches in Sri Lanka is protected legally. So maybe something like that could be one step forward towards putting all these things together and taking mangrove management forward. But given the complex situations, we still need a lot of strong legal policies to get these mangroves that are outside the protected area network into the mainstream. Yeah, that's a complex issue.
Thank you. Uh, there is a appreciation from Sushmita. Wonderful session. Thank you for answering all my questions. So that is she
I
want.
enjoyed also
Okay.
answering to the questions.
So, thank you, Dr. Nehru, for answering all the questions. And also, mangrove ecosystem is a very undervalued and also very neglected ecosystem, we can say, in especially in India, because we don't have any proper documentation, especially for the with respect to the east coast as well as west coast. So very less studies were done, and also now because of a post tsunami, we have slightly, there is a kind of provided improvement in with respect to the funding, as well as there are research studies also with respect to the mangrove ecosystem. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and also answering all the questions. So we look forward to have your association with near future. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this session.
Okay.
It was very interactive, and I really enjoyed. And it's no pain. And yeah, we will be having a very good time in the field. And before that, getting into getting some people know about mango is also as important as doing any research. So having Envis programs like this means a lot. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of this wonderful journey.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, dear participant, you can subscribe to our Envis IAC YouTube channel, so that we will let you know what are the future webinars. And this webinar is conducted under Ek Bharat Shresth Bharat initiative. And also, we just celebrated a World Wetland Day on February 2nd. So, mangroves has a significant role even with respect to the wetland ecosystem. So, with this, we are ending the webinar here. So please subscribe to channel so that you will come to know our future webinars. Thank you, Anandal. So we are ending the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.